buyer beware. There's no such thing as a shared responsibility matrix where an MSP says, we do all of it for you. I'm sorry, that's a dream world.
Hello, it's Jacob Pitt with GRC Academy. Today I'm here with Miss Joy Beland from Summit 7. Joy, how are you today?
I'm fantastic. It's always a pleasure to speak with you, Jacob.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. And folks, if you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to like, comment, share, subscribe, review, all the things. Helps me out. Thanks in advance. Joy, tell us about yourself. How'd you get to where you are today?
Well, the short version is I had my own MSP in Los Angeles for 21 years. I sold that practice back in 2018. I then spent a couple of years in the cybersecurity vendor community, working with MSPs, helping them understand cybersecurity as an MSP, all the fundamentals, developing training and boot camps for helping them out. I switched over to focus on CMMC, working under a C3PAO or a CMMC third-party assessment organization. Back in 2020, I think it was, I developed the curriculum for the CCP and CCA training. Really loved working with Edwards Performance Solutions, where I did that. And then I joined Summit 7 about 2.5 years ago, originally to work with their partner ecosystem. And I recently moved into my role now as the Vice President of Cybersecurity Compliance so that I can leverage everything I know and have been working toward in helping Summit 7 to get through our own CMMC Level 2 assessment, both as a managed service provider and as an OSC that would handle CUI.
Is Summit 7 the largest CMMC-focused MSP?
I believe so, but I don't know for a fact. I know we have about 250 employees now.
Yeah.
And we are only focused on the defense industrial base. I think that's probably the largest thing that separates us from other MSPs. Most MSPs are going to focus on multiple verticals, legal, finance, and we are solely focused on the defense industrial base.
I've been following you all forever. Summit 7 just does such a great job of putting out content that is so helpful. As you said, Summit 7, sole focus, defense industrial base. But you mentioned there's a ton of MSPs out there, and I imagine the level of security maturity as well as the compliance side is drastically different depending on who you're working with. How bad is it?
I think that's one of the most challenging things about the MSP industry is that there is no set criteria for what qualifies any organization, whether it's a very small MSP or a very large one, to be out there servicing the IT and cybersecurity needs of other businesses. There's no common criteria, no qualification. There's just a lot of research that needs to be done by the buyers, the organizations that leverage external service providers. And I think that that's changing now. In recent years, there is more focus on having some kind of a framework or a standard that MSPs are going to be aligning to. But by and large, the smaller MSPs are the ones that are most concerning. Some of them do a good job, but most of them really are eager for business. Mm-hmm. And without any set criteria that they are proving themselves in their abilities, they pretty much, if they can convince a organization to hire them on to handle their internal in IT and cybersecurity, that's just wherever they're starting from, and that skill level is what they're using.
The average business owner may not really understand why is it important to work with a security-focused MSP. These folks truly have the keys to your IT kingdom, which houses your data that your customers are entrusting you with. And it could just be a simple example of one of the MSP IT staff just getting socially engineered. And then the bad guys are into your environment.
Because I owned my own MSP for 21 years, I can tell you the maturity of the business, the end customer, their stakeholders, directly correlates with the maturity of the MSP that they're going to hire. Because they may look at that MSP as a necessary evil, just somebody to help fix the computers, and they will only pay what they will pay. And you very much get what you pay for when it comes to IT and cybersecurity skill level. I just wanted to say that there are some organizations that will never, ever pay an appropriate level for the support for their network. They just don't view it as necessary or important. They don't understand the risk or the business impact. That being said, when we are looking at the cybersecurity requirements or landscape for the defense industrial base as a category of customers out there, the adversaries are directly targeting those smaller suppliers as a way to get in through the supply chain and up and grab the types of information, the categories of controlled and classified information, even security protection data, the types of logs and reporting that's generated based on what the security posture is of those organizations. The more that they can get their hands on that kind of data from a smaller supplier that may not be as well protected, the easier they're going to have access to really critical infrastructure data and work their way up. This is a report that was generated for an RSA webinar that they were doing on how we can improve the security of the supply chain. And they just happened to focus in this report on the defense industrial base. You can see that with the blue representing the primes as the adversarial target back in 2008, and then the orange representing those very small suppliers in the supply chain to the primes, how the adversarial focus has shifted from the primes to the suppliers to modern day where the adversaries know it's a much easier path to get into that supply chain. And I always remind MSPs when I'm doing any kind of education around CMMC and what our mandate is in serving the defense industrial base, that the adversaries are actively attacking this particular industry in a way like no other. Not that MSPs aren't already a huge target, because the adversaries know if I get into an MSP, I've got the keys to the kingdom, like you said. But for the defense industrial base, it's particularly worrisome.
Most people understand why security would be important for an MSP, but why would you say compliance is also important for an MSP?
Well, we have a new thing in CMMC. It's really the first time that a standard has been applied to an industry where the Department of Defense has come through in 32 CFR and said, well, your MSP themselves doesn't have to have their own certification, but they are in scope for the certification. And that means that all of the compliance mandates that are incorporated, being NIST 800-171, now are going to apply equally to the MSP as they would to the OSC, or the organization seeking certification or organization seeking assessment. They have so many different acronyms going out there now. And really, this is the first time that compliance becomes just as crucial or is reflecting the implementation of security from the MSP right through to their customers.
What exactly does an MSP being in scope of CMMC mean?
At the highest level, the way that I like to describe it is, if your MSP is going to perform any of the security capabilities that are included in NIST 800-171 on your behalf, then they are included in scope. So whether it's the people that they're using, the tools that they're using, the processes that they're following, any of those things. I have a slide here that's going to talk through it. So there's two categories of data that an MSP might be interacting with, right? They might process, store, or transmit it. And the first type is controlled and classified information, CUI. The second type is that security protection data that I spoke about, the logs that are generated, reports, anything that is going to reflect the implementation or impact of the tools that they're leveraging on the security posture for their end customers. And then there's two types of asset types or categories that are assigned within CMMC to those managed service providers, depending on how they interact with that data. So it could be their people, their processes, their technology, or their facilities coming into scope as a CUI asset or a security protection asset. So it sounds like a lot of words. It's a little bit confusing. There's a graph that they included with 32 CFR that really kind of focuses in on a MSP or an MSSP, meaning a managed services provider or a managed security services provider that is not a cloud services provider. That's like Google, Microsoft, that the storage repository areas and tools you would use in order to actually save your data. A managed service provider or managed security services provider has different mandates, but very similar based on their interaction with the CUI or the SPD. Basically, both of these say they're going to be in scope, right? And the difference between a CUI asset and a security protection asset is so negligible because both of them are going to have as many of those CMMC requirements against them that they're going to have to show that they implemented pretty much equally, whether they're an SPA or a CUI asset. MSPs really have some big decisions to make around how are they going to participate in this and what is this compliance requirement going to do to their business model.
This language comes from the CMMC final now program rule, and they call them external service providers, which encompasses MSPs and MSSPs. And if I remember correctly, it said the definition of an external service provider is an organization that provides IT or cybersecurity services to the defense contractor, essentially. Would you say that's correct?
I would look at it like you've had Joe working in your own IT department for many years, and Joe leaves, and rather than replacing him, you hire a person or a company as an external service provider to do the same things that Joe was doing.
We all know that there are a lot of MSPs out there that are supporting defense contractors who aren't up to speed with NIST 800.71, with CMMC. What would be your recommendations for those MSPs and then also for the defense contractors who are being served by them?
The MSPs themselves have a long road if they have no exposure to CMMC. And we're seeing this. We actually are seeing a lot of organizations calling us now and saying, all along, our MSP has told us, don't worry, we're going to do CMMC for you. We've got you covered. And they're now finding out, now that the MSPs are seeing the reality of what they need to do, they're telling their customers, sorry, we actually are not going to take that on. You're going to have to find a different provider. And it's really leaving these organizations in a lurch because the readiness path, the journey to make sure that they are ready for their assessment is one that takes a long time. 12 to 18 months for the entire implementation is the average that we're seeing. And if they're going to rely on their MSP for getting them ready and having the MSP's own part of the scope handled and participating, they're putting a lot of faith into that MSP and saying, all right, our timing is going to match up. By the time that we need to have our assessment, you're going to be ready. Everything will be, in place. The MSPs really need to understand, first of all, what's involved. I highly recommend that if you're an MSP and you haven't started your journey, that you spend the money to get one of your engineers or help desk personnel into the CCP class. At a minimum, go through the GRC Academy for any CMMC related training that you've got because your training is outstanding. The CCP, the thing I like about it is that in the 5-day boot camp, they have to prove that knowledge, and now they have a credential that lends some credibility to that MSP that they can come back with and say, within the CMMC ecosystem, we have this credential, and it covers everything that's the foundational knowledge. I feel like the MSP can now make an informed decision on whether or not they want to participate in the CMMC ecosystem, because based on that person's guidance, they'll understand, what do we have to do to our tool stack? Like if they have tools, for example, that are supported by people that are not located in the United States, that could be a huge issue if the type of CUI their customers have is ITAR or export controlled, right? Mm-hmm. As an MSP, I leveraged a service that had a bunch of people from India that were doing the NOC or Network Operations Center review of my customers' servers. It saved a lot of money. They were highly skilled. They were able to work in the off hours. So, Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. in the United States. How was I going to do 24/7 support and make sure that the servers were being monitored and appropriately remedied if there was a problem with the log servers or something overnight? That India-based support was extremely helpful. in my being able to fulfill those contractual requirements to my customers.
Mhm.
I totally get it. But that may not be suitable at all for a
Mhm.
MSP that is focused on the defense industrial base and has CMMC requirements. So they have to go through all of their security stack and they have to reprice that tool set based on what is able to be leveraged and acceptable with CMMC. They have to look at their own personnel. Do I have U.S. citizens, U.S. persons on my own team as W-2 employees that would be accessing these environments? Have they received CUI training? What kind of security training do I need to add to and background checks? There's so much that they need to take into consideration. If they haven't already, they have to go through every single one of those NIST 800-171 controls and understand which of those capabilities are we doing on behalf of our customers.
Mhm.
And then they have to describe it in detail in the shared responsibility matrix. And now they're actually going to be generating contracts where they are going to be liable for performing those services on behalf of those customers, right? They're guaranteeing that, hey, we're in scope with you. We now are part of your assessment. And as long as you have a contract with us, we guarantee that we're going to be performing these capabilities as exactly outlined in our shared responsibility matrix. I mean, that whole journey takes so much time and resources, and I've only touched on a small part of it.
Talk to us about what a shared responsibility matrix is and actually what does that look like?
At Summit 7, we have several different service packages. Most MSPs do. You can buy like a basic or a premium, and some of those are going to be basic IT services, and the premium packages generally are going to include more the security-focused capabilities and more expensive for the MSP to provide that. So it's more expensive of a package for the consumer, right? So we went through the NIST 800-171 controls. There's 110 of them. And as you know, each control has its own set of assessment objectives, or what is the assessor going to want you to demonstrate in order to consider that one control to be completely implemented. And so, for example, what I'm showing you here is the control 3.1.3 for access control. And it has 5 different assessment objectives. And the shared responsibility matrix is going to have to break out by service package that the MSP offers, which of those assessment objectives they perform on behalf of their customers, which ones they share responsibility with their customer, where we do one part of it, but we can't do that unless you do this part of it, or we're responsible for the Microsoft, for example, GCC High portion, the Azure server portion of this, but you have your own servers that you support or someone else supports. So there may be a shared responsibility. And some of those assessment objectives, the MSP cannot be responsible at all, because there is always going to be some portion throughout NIST 800-171 that the organization themselves has to have accountability and responsibility for. An example is an MSP cannot decide for the organization who should be accessing CUI, right? That's not their call to make. That is the organization that receives the CUI and has the contract with the DoD to determine which of their staff members should have access to any given category or contract-related CUI. Now, they may tell the MSP who they've authorized to access that, and the MSP may implement that based on the authorization from the customer. But if buyer beware, there's no such thing, should never be any such thing as a shared responsibility matrix where an MSP says, we do all of it for you. We've seen 99% of the controls or 90% of the controls. I'm sorry, that's a dream world.
Yeah.
It just can't happen, because you can't remove and abdicate responsibility entirely for the OSC. So it's a detailed implementation map, really, what we're looking at here. And then at the higher level, if you wanted to just look at it this way, we also have to break in the vendors or the cloud service providers that share some responsibility for these controls. It really becomes a puzzle that you're putting together so that an assessor can look at any given control, an assessment objective, and understand very clearly who has responsibility for what. That's the shared responsibility matrix.
I really like this slide because you have the IT provider, right, working with the cloud platform or the IT system, and then hand in hand with the customer. And everyone has their different responsibilities, and it's all documented as to who does what, which if it's not documented, then things are not going to be done properly. And there could be CUI spillages or breaches, and then you got to report incidents, and then that's no fun and all those things. And it takes time and everybody gets grumpy. What could happen if it's not documented?
Well, the customer won't be able to have their assessment. If the assessor walks in and the customer is leveraging an MSP who has not taken the time to do a shared responsibility matrix, that's a hard stop because the MSP is a separate entity, an external service provider, and the requirement is that they have the shared responsibility matrix, that they are participating in the assessment, providing the artifacts, any evidence that the assessor asks to see, for demonstrate how you have implemented this. You say you're responsible, so show me how you do it. Unfortunately, we might see that happen at the outset of the CMMC assessments, and it's going to be kind of a crisis and really difficult for those organizations that have spent the money to get ready on their own with their own capabilities to find out that their MSP isn't ready or hasn't done their part correctly. It's a hard fail. They now may be jeopardizing the timeline that they've had to get ready and get their certification and may lose their DoD contract or lose the opportunity to bid on a contract that they were counting on. So it's very serious.
Like you said, from the proposed program rule to the final, that language was added about having the shared responsibility matrix for an ESP. That's a hard requirement. So if you don't have one, you're totally hosed. And if you do have one, but it's questionable, your assessor is going to pick up on that as they go. Like, how would they do that for you?
Yeah.
And that's going to cause problems for yourself as well. And certain requirements can't be POAM'd. So this is something that's very critical.
Exactly.
Hey everyone, Jacob here. Let me tell you about today's sponsor, Vanta. As the number and severity of third-party breaches continues to rise, companies are increasingly vigilant, not just about how they handle their own data, but how their vendors do as well. For security and compliance leaders, this means more security reviews are coming across your desk every day, and valuable time is being wasted on manual security reviews. With Vanta questionnaire automation, security and compliance teams can complete security reviews up to 5 times faster, giving you time back to focus on running your security and compliance programs. Over 8,000 global companies like ZoomInfo, Smart Recruiters, and Noibu use Vanta to save time on security reviews. Visit vanta.com/GRC Academy to learn more about questionnaire automation. That's vanta.com/GRC Academy. Thanks and enjoy the rest of the episode.
You know, I want to bring up to you that I've been having this conversation with a lot of MSPs because when 32 CFR came out and in the end said your MSP does not have to have their own certification, but they are in scope. And I ask MSPs when I'm presenting this at conferences, and I'm like, how many of you were really excited that you don't have to have your own certification? It's astounding how many of them are like laughing and raising their hand. They're like, well, we don't have to have our own. I'm like, but do you understand that actually is going to be harder and more expensive in the long run for the MSPs that only have a few customers in the defense industrial base? And they're like, no problem. We'll do the shared responsibility matrix and show up and be a part of their assessment. Because really, if you compare an uncertified MSP and what they need to do with the certified MSP and what they need to do, I think they're going to look at the return on investment and understand it's actually better to be all in and get that certification and have more defense industrial based customers start to use this as a larger part of our service delivery target, right? Or let them go. Because there's so many common things, whether you get certified or not. You can see with the no's and the yeses on my slide. And even, you know, the very first thing I have here of an MSP having their own system security plan, to get your certification as an MSP, I just want to point out that a lot of them will say, but we only have to have our shared responsibility matrix. but they will be required to describe their scope, their inventory, what's in the assessment. And those are all requirements that are at the front of the SSP. And I would argue if I'm an MSP that's looking to get certified for CMMC, I really should know and prove that I can do my own SSP.
Mm-hmm.
I'm supporting that for all of my customers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then if you keep going down the list, you would have to have your SRM done anyways, the shared responsibility matrix. You'd have to have your technicians trained. You'd have to have the processes and the systems set up, all the policies, all the tools formally documented. That's the same. You'd have to understand your customer's contract requirements in CUI categories. That's going to be the same.
Hey, folks. So we are going back in time a little bit. We recorded this, and then version 2 of the CMMC assessment process was released. And now we have some new information.
Murphy's Law, right?
That's right.
The CAP 2.0 document came out, Jacob, December 16th, surprised us all with a sentence that none of us expected, that even if a external service provider, meaning an MSP in this scenario, has their own CMMC level 2 certification, they will still need to participate in the assessment with the OSC, supposedly on some kind of a more limited basis with a less burden of proof for the evidence. We don't really know what that looks like, and it's very disappointing. It's definitely going to add a financial burden for the OSC. It's going to add a financial and resource burden for the MSPs themselves, especially the smaller MSPs that don't have a lot of dedicated CMMC resources. So really disappointed to see this. I think the entire industry was surprised by it, but that's what the CAP 2.0 says. We wanted to make sure we're giving accurate information, and we changed a yes on that fifth line there to attend the full CMMC assessment with each DoD client, sadly.
When you're certified, there will be, I think, less of a burden to provide evidence because obviously you'll have that shared responsibility matrix that goes along with that. And then there's some additional trust, I think, from the assessor based on being certified. So it's not a total loss, but the MSP and the OSC will need to plan on the MSP still representing during the assessment, unfortunately.
Agreed. And then would you be able to standardize your CMMC delivery, right? Rather than doing something special for just 1 or 2 customers and different for all the rest of your customers, if you're focused on CMMC and certified as an MSP to deliver CMMC services, you're going to be able to standardize how you do delivery across those defense industrial-based customers. And in the end, that allows for more automation, more innovation. Your whole team is walking the same compliance direction. It actually is going to be saving you money in the long run.
Now, talk to us about CUI and security protection data. How would CUI get into a MSP's environment?
A couple of common ways that a lot of MSPs aren't really taking into consideration. The first would be if they back up their customer data to their own servers or their own data center, right? And that may not be in a GCC high environment. It may not have the right type of encryption. It may not be encrypting it. Where are the encryption keys located? Are they saved with the backup? There's a bunch of ways that MSPs easily mess that up and don't understand that they actually now are bringing CUI into their environment. Another way is that whatever kind of MDR or XDR solution they're using oftentimes is going to copy a file in, and if it believes it's infected, and launch it, and determining whether or not that is a threat, a genuine threat in a sandbox environment. And now it's taking it out of the customer environment, bringing it into the cloud service provider, that tool provider's environment. I would say another one too, and an easy one, is that a lot of MSPs, when they use remote management tools, there are capabilities built in to transfer files back and forth in those tools. Back in the day when I was running my help desk, that's what I did, right? I would copy over a tool I needed, paste it into the customer's environment, deploy it there, or I would grab the file that they're having problems with, bring it into my environment, fix it, and put it back. Like, there's so many ways that quick service that you guarantee being able to solve things as fast as you can, want it to be really good in providing support to your customers. you're not realizing that you're actually bringing that sensitive data into your own environment or your tool provider's environment. And you've now broken that boundary for the CUI.
Talk to us about security protection data. Can you go into a little bit more about what that is? And is that something that needs to be protected? Is it a scoping consideration? What actually is it?
So I had to email the Pentagon and I got a response because I was like, can you help me understand the actual requirements? If it's a cloud service provider and they have security protection data. So let's take the example of like a vulnerability scanner. And it's saving the results, the logs from the vulnerability scans in the cloud of that tool provider. That is considered security protection data, and it now is housed by a cloud service provider. It's not CUI though. It's just basically the tracking or reporting for anything security related. And the answer that came back is if it's a cloud service provider, that they have to provide the shared responsibility matrix. They have to actually go through NIST 800-171 and identify how they're protecting that data and what areas they are taking responsibility for on behalf of the MSP or the OSC. So remember my puzzle pieces, SPD now comes in, those tool sets for SPD now come in as a shared responsibility matrix link that you have to add into the puzzle. For an MSP, that maybe they just have all of the logs coming into their environment. Their SIEM tool is bringing in all of the logs from the firewalls and all of the different applications into the MSP environment. That security protection data has to be protected, level commensurate with what kind of security capability is it providing. For antivirus, it's a security protection asset. So the applicable controls that it is performing those capabilities, you're demonstrating in your shared responsibility matrix how that tool is being leveraged and what capabilities it provides.
I'm thinking about typical government systems out there. Vulnerability scans associated with those would be a higher level of sensitivity, right? Because it can show possibly how they could be exploited. So same kind of thing here, right? That data is sensitive data. That makes sense.
Some types of CUI actually call out that the system security plan itself is CUI. Okay. Some critical programs, the SSP for the OSC itself is CUI. So if you're using a GRC tool to build out an SSP for a customer that has that category of CUI, the tool that you're using has to meet the SPD and CUI requirements. So DFAR 7012 is going to apply to it. It has to be FedRAMP.
Now, let's say the MSP only has security protection data. There's no CUI. They verified that through various scoping activities. Is it still wise? And I think it still would be, but would you still recommend them to get CMMC certified, even if they're not handling any CUI at all?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And just for those reasons you've already listed, right?
Yeah. And they're performing the capabilities on behalf of the customer. No matter what kind of data is coming in or out, their people and their tools are going to be in scope.
Let's say that you've hired this IT person and that person is using a laptop that is owned by your organization, and he's just been provided that laptop, but he's not an employee. He's a third-party contractor, 1099 perhaps. What does that look like?
And you would want to make sure that they are aligning with the personnel security, the training, the physical security controls that would be applicable to your normal employees. It's a smart way to do it, to provide the actual laptops. You would want to make sure, okay, where are they using the laptop? If it's an environment outside of the customer environment, then are there remote worker policies that would apply to them? Really think through everything that would apply to a normal employee that may apply to this. Basically, they're a 1099 contractor at that point, right?
Right. And I'll say that way of doing things is not scalable. For sure. Because I mean, you could tell us, but MSPs, they have all of these tools to handle central management, I'm sure, and all those things. But, that's a way to work around this problem, but not scalable at all from an
Yeah.
MSP
I mean, is the
standpoint.
MSP going to close one laptop, open up another one, a whole different system for MFA? It's crazy.
Right.
That is crazy making to want to do
Yes.
that.
Now, let's talk about some of the specific challenges that MSPs have when they're preparing for CMMC, implementing NIST 800-171, scoping issues. Let's dig into that a little bit.
It's harder for me to speak to that because I am super blessed that Summit 7 from the outset has incorporated our entire infrastructure in GCC High.
Okay.
We only leverage tools that are FedRAMP. We only have U.S. citizens for staff.
Mm-hmm.
And every employee and tool that we use has been designed to be included in our CMMC scope. So we haven't had to go through and carve out, well, this team works only with financial customers, and separate out what tools are they using, what kind of training do they need to go through. We've done it as an entire body, which honestly, the largest MSPs that are focused on CMMC are doing the same thing. Mm-hmm. There isn't any trying to justify the use of something that may or may not work with the CMMC environment or personnel. For most MSPs, they're going to have to make some serious decisions around what is in scope and what is not. There are a couple resources out there, like the MSP Cyber Exchange, that are peer groups of MSPs working with CCAs, even lead CCAs. There's other peer groups that are not nonprofits that are really good. There's the MSP Collective. And both of those organizations, full transparency, I'm on the board of the MSP Collective and the MSP Cyber Exchange, both nonprofits, and both serving different purposes. But the MSP Collective, once an MSP decides they are going to go all in and get their CMMC certification, they have CCPs, CCAs on staff, then they would join the MSP Collective to help us to continue to influence what good looks like for the MSP ecosystem with the CMMC. As they get ready, there's just so much that goes into that scoping conversation. And each one is going to want to leverage a consultant or a peer group of some kind. Like my best advice is don't do it alone. Because with CMMC, you don't know what you don't know. That's the hardest part. I think that's the same for a lot of OSCs that think that they're ready for their assessment. And then we experience this with the JSVAs that they would get called DIBCAC, we're ready, we want the JSVA. And then the result would be a negative 45 for their score. And they really thought they were ready because they didn't leverage external advice and expertise in that preparation process. MSPs should be doing the same thing.
For contractors out there, they already have an MSP, or maybe they're looking for one. What questions should they be asking to make sure that they have the right MSP?
I'll give you a few of them just off the top of my head, but there's also some outstanding questionnaires out there that they can go to and download for themselves. But the first would be, have you completed your shared responsibility matrix and can I see it? Even a draft of it, because I showed you an example of what it should look like. And if the MSP doesn't know what a shared responsibility matrix is, or says, oh, we're working on it, but we can't show you for another 4 months or 6 months, and is not even willing to share what that draft looks like, then you got to be worried. Ask them if they have a CCP on their staff. Ask them if they are working with a C3PAO in helping them to get ready. Ask them if they have other customers that have already been through a joint surveillance voluntary assessment or a DIPCAC assessment, because that's really going to be telling. If they've been through it a few times already, then they're going to be able to speak to these things a lot better. Ask them if they know how to calculate the score for the customer, for the SPRF score. If they've done that for any of their customers before. Are they familiar with 32 CFR and 48 CFR? and what those contract requirements would look like. Have they read DFAR 7012? When I was responsible for partnerships with Summit 7, I would ask other MSPs who wanted to partner with us questions like that. And, they'd stare blankly at me. Oh, okay, so we have some work to do, and I'd be like, start with the CCP class. There is the NDISAC has a questionnaire for MSPs, and I think that Compliance IT has one. A few other resources out there that are really great for you to just download a copy, send it to your MSP and say, I need it back by Friday, see what they do.
Tell us more about the MSP Collective and what your work over there looks like.
It's actually been pretty exciting. First of all, I love the idea of us reaching out to some of our larger competitors and saying, hey, we can do this so much more effectively if we do it together instead of trying to do it alone. And so we have a dozen or so MSPs that have joined already and many more that are going through that vetting process right now. But there's a few different things that we are looking to do as our official mission of the MSP Collective. The first is making sure that we are helping to influence legislation in obtaining appropriate funding for the very small DIB contractors that are going to have to get through CMMC somehow. The amount of money it takes is extraordinary for the small business. The percentage of money that they're spending on IT and cyber to stay in the defense ecosystem now with CMMC is going to be so much harder. We're looking to influence with tax incentives, any way that we might be able to work with legislation in bringing some kind of relief to the very small businesses, especially if they leverage an MSP to tie those together so that it's a win-win, right? Because there's some very small MSPs that are also struggling just as hard. Great MSPs, just very small. And how are they going to get aligned with CMMC just like their customers need to? So that's the first part of it. The second part is that we help to author a scoping guide with recommendations on how an MSP would be scoped. Housing some kind of a formal marketplace or repository for the MSPs who are actually certified with CMMC Level 2 so that a OSC can go to a marketplace and identify and look at the shared responsibility matrix and say, I only need this limited set of capabilities. They would be the perfect MSP for me, or I need as much as possible. I'm going to go with this one, and knowing that they've already been validated with their CMMC Level 2 certifications. Those are the types of things that we're looking to do. And eventually look at, is NIST 800-171A an appropriate standard or framework for MSPs, knowing it focuses on confidentiality, or would we want to build in the availability and integrity parts of the CMMC or the cybersecurity triad and apply that to MSPs as kind of a different or a higher bar once we have CMMC addressed? Not right off the bat, but really looking at what's appropriate for us to continue to kind of put forward what we think is that next step in what good looks like.
Well, let's finish then with some super crazy war stories in relation to MSPs and CMMC. Tell us some.
In the MSP ecosystem, the same as any other industry, you have solid information, and then you have people just kind of making things up, kind of winging it.
Yeah.
And I was recently at an MSP conference, and there was a panel that was MSP experts or CMMC experts on the panel. And I was in the audience. And the funny thing is when the panel members were answering some of the questions that were so far off base from being correct, there were people in the audience turning around and staring at me like, aren't you going to say something? And I was just like, sitting on my hands, trying not to interfere. But, there was one of the panelists said, I went through the CCP class and I decided I don't want to have to become an expert in CMMC. So I'm telling my customers to go out there and get ready, and I'll just do the IT part of it. And I'm sitting there going, there is no such thing as what you just said. No such thing. And invalidates any knowledge you might have gained from the CCP class, right? It's just horrifying. Another experience is that I had performed a formal mock assessment as a 1099 with the C3PAO. And this is a fairly large defense contractor that hired a very large, well-known MSP. I was just one of the assessment team members, and I arrived on site, seated next to the MSP representing the contractor. And it's just a mock assessment, right? But I'm not allowed to give advice in a mock assessment. I'm only allowed to say met, not met. I was seated next to an MSP that had a laptop with stickums on it with their passwords.
Oh, no.
Let's start with that. They didn't understand, based on Microsoft GCC High's SSP, how to populate the shared responsibility matrix and or their own shared responsibility matrix. And the mock assessment was a dismal failure as a direct result of every control that the MSP was actually performing that capability on behalf of the customer. All the areas where the defense contractor themselves are responsible, they were nailing it. And it was super uncomfortable, but I don't even know if that MSP knew that I have such a deep background with MSPs. And I heard of a JSVA, they had during the JSVA stress test week that back in October, I was a lead assessor for one. We have a few other team members that were lead assessors for others as 1099s under C3PAOs. And without sharing any customer names, we just compared scores. And ironically, out of the four of us, the one score that was the absolute worst was the defense contractor that was leveraging an MSP. The others were doing it themselves without an MSP. And the one leveraging the MSP actually was the -45. I do so much education around this. Summit 7 does so much education around this because we really do want to raise the bar. We really do want people to be successful. I'll answer anybody's questions. I'll present at every MSP conference I can to make sure that people understand they have to take this seriously. And I always say, if it comes to CMMC and you're an MSP, go all in or stand down. I really feel that there's too much risk not to make that decision that black and white.
Well, folks, vet your MSPs, call Summit 7. Really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for coming on.
Anytime, Jacob. Thank you for having me.
Hey, folks, hope you enjoyed that. If you want to see more, be sure to subscribe and then check out this video.